Hello, Music History 3. This is Jamie, and I am going to give a brief explanation of the music of Africa, really just looking at the culture and how it influences the music, and then we'll look at the music itself in class tomorrow morning. Sorry that this is late. I apologize. Alrighty, so we've been learning how music changes with culture, and that culture is an ever-changing aspect of human existence. So there's really no simple way you can analyze African music because it's constantly changing and growing and expanding, and it's hard to condense it to a few identifiable characteristics. But we shall do our best. When you think of African music, sometimes you think of just like the instruments itself. You think of a lot of drums and a lot of unison and polyphony and vocal parts and such. When you think of Africa just on its own, you can think of like the grandeur of the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, or the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. All these images are evoked, and we have Ethiopia, we have Swahili, Morocco, Tanzania. There's so many aspects to Africa that makes the music what it is today. So let's get on with some facts just about the continent itself, and I want to share this quote first. The text, our world music text, says, "We would be poetic and say where its people are, there is Africa's music, on the continent and in its diaspora. The truth, however, is messier." And so that's totally true of Africa, and we'll see why. So here's some facts about the country. It's the second largest continent in the world. It's comprised of 54 countries, and there's also one non-self-governing territory known as the Western Sahara. And except for Ethiopia and Liberia, each of these countries were colonized by foreign powers during the scramble for Africa that occurred between the years of 1881 and 1914. Before the colonial rule, there were nearly 10,000 identifiable states or autonomous groups, each with their own unique languages and dialects. So very diverse. That said, it's evident that the term African really involves numerous factors which make up the identity of each country and then the continent as a whole. Africa is divided into two zones. North of the equator is forgive my pronunciation, the Maghreb, something like that. That's any country that is north, and then to the south we have the sub-Saharan Africa. Africa boasts of 16% of the world's population. That's about 1.1 billion people, and it's 50% of the population. They're under the age of 25, so that also gives a special dynamic to the music, as we'll see in the future here. Among its many languages and dialects spoken by the African people, the most prominent are Arabic, English, Swahili, and French. It's also known as the poorest and most undeveloped continent. But it is really valuable for trade, and so that's what really keeps Africa alive. It trades a lot with China, and so that becomes Africa really becomes the prime resource for other countries and nations as far as innovation and inventions and resilience and adaptations go. So with its the amount of geographical and linguistic diversity that exists within Africa, the question would arise, what is African? And to the African people, the term African is really symbolic. It relates more to their homeland and the place where they belong and where they're empowered. It's their source of wisdom, particularly for those who practice two religions. One's called Santeria and the other one is Vodun. Those religions really look at Africa as a whole as being their source of wisdom. Their personal identity, that really doesn't have as much to do with the term African. Their identity is found in other more local connections, such as gender, the place where they grew up and where they live, their age, their kinship, work, and most importantly, their religion. While it's multifaceted, Africa is, the African people mainly adhere to Christianity and Islam, while other religions also include Hinduism and Buddhism. But again, this is very multifaceted, so there's a lot of differences between Christianity or Islam, the way it's practiced from country to country. Just as there are many Christian denominations, religious practices in Africa also depend on just the oral traditions that have been passed down, and just the different practices will reflect that. I want to share a quote. I put part of it here on the slide. This is from Robert Baum. He's a professor of religion, but also in Africa and African American Studies at Dartmouth College. He says that the African religious systems are not limited to the beliefs in supernatural beings and ritual acts of worship, but affect all aspects of life. And this is continuing the quote, it says, like most religious systems, African religions focus on the eternal questions of what it means to be human. What is the meaning of life? What are the correct relations among humans, between humans and spiritual powers, and with the natural world? African religious systems also seek to explain the persistence of evil and suffering, and they seek to portray the world as operating with some degree of order and predictability. And so that's kind of a general statement, so there's a lot of room for different denominations, so-called, among the African people and culture. Let us move on to the music aspect just for a bit, and then we'll go over the rest in class in the morning. Africa exists today as a highly diversified country, a continent, geographically and culturally, so we can expect the same diversity to exist within the music. One of the most important elements of African music is that it's part of everyday life, and it's not used purely for enjoyment. This was also mentioned by Andrew in his presentation. Music is used for a child's naming ceremony, for wedding receptions, agricultural activities, religious ceremonies, telling stories. Very important for keeping record of oral tradition, so it's a way of passing down information and stories. And also music, what's interesting with the African culture, music apart from dance or really any other art form is non-existent. In fact, there isn't a word for just music, there isn't a word for dance. The term that the Africans use is a combination of two. And so music and dance go hand in hand, and that's something very characteristic to African music. Music truly had its voice in the 1500s. This is during the African slave trade, when music also was used to just kind of explain and portray the agony and the tragedy of slavery as it was taking place around the world. And so the Africans would use it as a way of kind of, getting their emotions out, getting their thoughts out. It was their voice at that time. Okay, moving on lastly, really quick, these are the elements that you might want to remember, and they're going to be discussed further tomorrow. Elements of African music. There is a heavy use of percussion, also call and response, where there's a leader and then the rest of the people will mimic or repeat the leader, either musically with instruments or with lyrics. There's also a lot of lyrical repetition, ostinato usage, and finally rhythmic polyphony. So those are 5 elements that we're going to look at tomorrow, and I have a lot of videos to share with you as well. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching. See you in the morning.